Get out of my house right now. Before you throw me out of this house, Luke, perhaps you should ask whose name is on the deed. Madeline walked into the family dining room that night as a wife, but was treated like a trespasser. In front of everyone, Luke pointed his finger at her and demanded a divorce, believing that his word alone was enough to strip her of the mansion, the company, and the family name. What he did not know was that behind the silence of the woman he despised lay contracts, old debts, and a truth capable of flipping the table before dessert was even served. That evening, the person who seemed to be getting expelled was, in reality, the only one keeping that prestigious family from crumbling to the ground. Madeline said those words without raising her voice, without slamming her hands on the mahogany table, and without looking at Claire, who sat smiling in the chair where for 7 years only Luke's wife had been permitted to sit. The dining room of the Upper East Side mansion was entirely too bright for such an intimate humiliation, adorned with crystal chandeliers, white porcelain, heavy silver cutlery, and freshly brewed coffee served in delicate cups after a dinner that no one had genuinely tasted. Luke was still standing with his arm outstretched and his finger pointing at her, as if he were directing a dismissed employee to the exit. Enough. Madeline, I want a divorce. His mother, Charlotte, adjusted her pearl necklace and murmured that they should not make a scene. Claire slowly crossed her legs and added, with a tone as sweet as poison, that it might be better for everyone if she accepted this with grace. Madeline gently placed her crystal water glass back onto the table. Grace, she repeated, finally shifting her gaze to her husband. Luke clenched his jaw tightly. You heard me. Pack your belongings tomorrow morning. This house is no longer your place. It was then that she delivered the sentence that caused a heavy silence to fall over the room like a locked iron door. For several agonizing seconds, nobody dared to breathe properly. The patriarch, Arthur, seated at the head of the table, kept his hand resting on his linen napkin, but his fingers trembled ever so slightly. Charlotte averted her eyes far too quickly, and Madeline noticed it immediately. She always noticed everything. For years, she had been mistaken for a passive woman simply because she had learned to observe deeply before offering any response. At that long table, every single person played a specific role. Luke was the impatient and entitled heir. Charlotte was the fierce guardian of their social reputation. Arthur was the exhausted man who only pretended he was still in charge. Claire was the forbidden guest, desperately trying to appear inevitable. And Madeline was the mistake they all wanted to erase before New York high society began to whisper. Have you lost your mind, Luke? Madeline asked with a humorless laugh. Are you trying to threaten me in front of your entire family? She ran her thumb over her golden wedding band, not to cherish it, but to remind herself of the exact, crushing weight of everything she had swallowed over the years. I am not threatening anyone. I am merely suggesting that you read the paperwork before pointing fingers. Claire leaned forward, accusing Madeline of emotional blackmail and trying to turn a simple separation into a cheap spectacle. Madeline did not dignify Claire with a response. Women like her constantly needed an audience, but all Madeline needed that night was a clear telephone line. Luke took 2 aggressive steps around the table, acting as if physical proximity could restore the authority his voice was rapidly losing. He wore a crisp white shirt without a tie, his handsome face hardened by an arrogance his family had applauded since he was a little boy. In the corporate boardrooms of Wall Street, he knew exactly how to smile at bankers, negotiate with ruthless investors, and crush his competitors using impeccably polite sentences. Yet at home, whenever Madeline contradicted him, he reverted to being a terrified son, desperately afraid of not appearing strong enough for his parents. He told her she would sign the divorce papers the next morning, promising a comfortable apartment for a few months, a reasonable allowance, and absolute discretion, claiming it was more than most women would receive after living off their husbands for so many years. That final sentence pierced Madeline like a rusty blade, not because it was a surprise, but because he had finally spoken it out loud in its entirety. Charlotte closed her eyes for a fleeting moment, not out of pity for her daughter-in-law, but out of a deep-seated fear of the wrong word being spoken at the wrong time. Madeline took a slow, deep breath. Living off my husband? She repeated, her tone laced with genuine curiosity. Is that the fairy tale you sold to her as well? Claire lost her smug smile for half a second, and that was more than enough. Claire's presence at that table was a meticulously calculated provocation. She wore a dark green dress, discreet enough to fake respect, yet expensive enough to announce her conquest. Throughout the evening, she had continuously praised the wine cellar, the interior decor, and the illuminated garden, acting as if she were already deciding where to hang her own paintings once Madeline was gone. Madeline had watched all of this with her hands resting quietly in her lap, remembering another dinner exactly 5 years earlier, when this very dining room was plunged into absolute terror. On that night, Arthur had been crying hidden away in his study because creditors were practically breaking down the door, and the family name was just 1 week away from becoming a scandalous headline. Back then, Luke was away on a business trip, Charlotte was ready to secretly sell her heirloom jewelry, and Madeline had made the first crucial phone call to the man now saved in her contacts as Dr. Robert. Nobody ever thanked her afterward. Acknowledging her help would mean recognizing their dependence, and this proud family would rather die than owe their salvation to a quiet woman. Madeline pulled out her simple, unassuming cell phone, unlocked the screen, found the contact, and pressed the call button. Luke let out a short, mocking laugh, asking if she was calling a friend or a hairdresser to come pick her up. Madeline looked at him with a profound calmness that wounded him far more than any scream ever could. "I am calling my attorney," she stated. Claire raised her eyebrows in disbelief, while Charlotte turned completely pale before the call even connected. On the third ring, a professional masculine voice answered. Madeline activated the speakerphone without asking for anyone's permission. "Dr. Robert, good evening. I apologize for the late hour. The family has decided to advance the discussion regarding my divorce. Could you kindly confirm the existence of the asset shielding agreement signed in 2019? The word shielding shattered the tension in the room like breaking glass. On the other end of the line, the lawyer confirmed that the agreement existed, was fully registered, and legally bound specific properties, corporate shares, and guarantees entirely to her. Madeline stood up, leaving her ring untouched, and announced she would sleep in the guest room not out of a lack of rights, but out of an overwhelming sense of disgust. Luke did not sleep a single wink that night. At 20 minutes to 4 in the morning, he was still locked inside the mansion's vast study, completely surrounded by thick folders that had never seemed threatening to him before. The Upper East Side house had grown entirely silent after Madeline walked up the grand staircase to the guest room, but that silence brought absolutely no peace. It was the specific kind of quiet that forces a wealthy family to finally hear the sound of the foundations cracking behind their expensive velvet-lined walls. Spread across the dark mahogany desk were old bank contracts, board meeting minutes, corporate addendums, and an incomplete copy of a financial report from 2019. Madeline's name appeared on those pages multiple times, not as an accompanying spouse or a decorative witness, but as a primary guarantor, a major investor, and a deeply vested stakeholder. Luke gripped the heavy papers with such intense force that he completely crumpled the margins of a highly confidential document. "This makes absolutely no sense," he murmured into the empty room. "She never had this kind of money." But his sentence died in his throat before he could finish it, because he suddenly realized he had never genuinely asked what Madeline possessed, before she became a member of his prestigious family. To him, her past was merely a closed room that held no interest, as long as she fit perfectly into the main ballroom of his own life. Charlotte entered the study without knocking, wearing a navy blue silk robe and an exhausted expression that made her look as though she had aged 10 full years in a single night. She suggested he try to get some rest, but her trembling voice clearly betrayed that she had not come out of maternal concern. Luke held up a heavily redacted contract and demanded to know what it was. Charlotte stared at the paper from a distance, refusing to step any closer, and dismissed it as just old documents belonging to his father. He let out a harsh, joyless laugh, begging his mother not to treat him like a naive child anymore. He pointed out that Madeline's signature was all over the company's financial guarantees, and that Dr. Robert had explicitly mentioned a corporate restructuring. Charlotte walked slowly toward the silver tray on the credenza and poured herself a small glass of water, acting as if every refined, calculated movement could somehow mask her overwhelming guilt. She finally confessed that she knew Madeline had stepped in to help during a particularly delicate moment for their empire. Luke slammed the heavy contract onto the solid wood desk, demanding to know how she helped, questioning if she had contributed a massive fortune while he was completely kept in the dark. Charlotte closed her eyes tightly. For a brief, terrible moment, the flawless mask of the perfect matriarch completely slipped, revealing a terrified woman who was not afraid of the injustice committed, but deeply afraid of losing absolute control over the family's narrative. She explained that his father was completely desperate. The banks were heavily pressuring them, and the entire company was on the verge of total collapse before Madeline quietly offered a viable way out. Luke stood frozen in place, utterly devastated that his parents had accepted such an enormous sacrifice without ever breathing a single word of it to him. Charlotte turned to him with a sudden, defensive harshness, finding it much easier to go on the attack than to humbly beg for his forgiveness. She reminded him that he was in New York at the time, desperately, trying to close a massive negotiation that was failing while his father faced absolute public humiliation. According to Charlotte, Madeline had finally proven she was useful for something other than just smiling prettily at high society charity galas. The sheer cruelty of that statement did not surprise Luke as much as it should have, because he had heard similar sentiments, whispered in elegant restaurants and private phone calls for years. But in the early hours of that morning, after hearing the cold facts from her attorney, the phrase sounded entirely different. It was not mere contempt. It was deeply rooted terror disguised as arrogance. Luke quietly asked his mother if she hated his wife simply because she had been the one to save them. Gripping her glass, Charlotte insisted she never hated Madeline, but she knew that the very second high society discovered their traditional dynasty relied entirely on the silent wealth of a daughter-in-law. Without a famous surname, everything they had built would instantly shatter. By the time dawn broke over Manhattan, Madeline walked out of the towering mansion without carrying any large suitcases. She wore a simple beige dress, her hair neatly tied back, carrying only a small leather handbag, and wearing the exhausted face of someone who had spent the entire night weeping internally without letting a single tear fall to be used as ammunition against her. Sebastian, the loyal butler, was waiting patiently in the grand marble foyer next to a silver tray holding a single cup of freshly brewed coffee. He kindly offered to summon the family chauffeur, but she gently accepted the warm cup, holding it closely for a few lingering moments like someone bidding a final farewell to a daily routine that was no longer hers. She softly told Sebastian that she had already requested a private car, thanking him sincerely for his unwavering kindness over the past 7 years. Before she could step through the heavy front doors, Luke appeared at the top of the sweeping staircase, still wearing the heavily wrinkled white shirt from the disastrous dinner the night before. He asked if she was really going to leave without speaking to him. Madeline did not even bother to look up at him. She simply took a slow, deliberate sip of her warm coffee. She reminded him that just hours ago he had ordered her to pack her belongings, and she was merely complying with his explicit demands. Walking down a few steps, Luke desperately confessed that he had been completely unaware of the hidden financial contracts. Madeline set her delicate china cup back onto the silver tray and softly replied that she already knew he was ignorant. She added that his ignorance was the most painful part of their marriage, because he had never once found it necessary to truly know who she was. The sleek black town car arrived at the wrought iron gates just past 7 o'clock in the morning. The bustling city was already pulsing with relentless urgency. Delivery trucks cutting through wide avenues, anxious executives rushing with briefcases, and small corner cafes swinging their doors open to greet the busy masses. Madeline slid into the quiet back seat without turning around to say goodbye to Charlotte, who was watching from a second-story window, completely motionless like a dusty, forgotten portrait. Luke remained frozen at the grand entrance, intensely torn between running after his wife and preserving his stoic, powerful facade in front of the household staff. As always, he tragically chose the facade. Madeline stared out the tinted window as the car drove downtown, watching the morning sun reflect harshly off the tall glass skyscrapers, fully realizing that the true battle for her dignity was only just beginning. The apartment Madeline retreated to was not a new purchase. It was a quiet, modest space in Greenwich Village that she had owned for many years, bought long before she ever married into the wealthy family. She had kept it a closely guarded secret, not out of any sense of shame, but out of a desperate, lingering need to have at least one safe haven where she could breathe without asking for anyone's permission. Upon entering, she was greeted by the comforting scent of light wood, a narrow balcony offering a sweeping view of the downtown skyline, and a thick blue folder resting innocently on the kitchen island, delivered by Dr. Roberts' trusted courier. Attached to the folder was a small, crisp note bearing a single, heavily weighted sentence indicating that everything was prepared, should she decide to move forward with the aggressive, legal strategy. Madeline slowly removed her shoes, walked barefoot toward the sunlit window, and finally allowed her tense shoulders to drop. While Madeline was meticulously organizing the complex legal documents on her small dining table, Claire confidently arrived at Luke's corporate headquarters on Wall Street, acting as if she already owned the entire building. The towering glass skyscraper, with its sleek, minimalist reception area and highly discreet security guards, had always seemed to her like a holy temple of the exact kind of immense power she so desperately craved. Wearing oversized designer sunglasses and carrying a ridiculously expensive imported leather bag, she marched past the front desk with a carefully practiced, arrogant urgency. Luke's dedicated executive assistant, Jessica, immediately stood up from her desk upon seeing the uninvited guest approach the private suite. She politely but firmly informed the demanding woman that Mr. Luke had not yet arrived and that his daily schedule was entirely blocked off for private matters. Claire slowly lowered her dark sunglasses, flashing a deeply unsympathetic, condescending smile at the young assistant. She told Jessica that, after the explosive events of the previous evening, it would be highly beneficial for her to start getting accustomed to some major permanent changes in the office hierarchy. Jessica did not offer a verbal response, but her sharp eyes quietly registered the immense arrogance dripping from every word the mistress spoke. Once inside the private office, Claire immediately walked straight over to Luke's massive oak desk, casually touching his expensive silver pen, inspecting the framed corporate photographs, and carefully sliding open one of the lateral storage drawers. She was not foolishly looking for romantic love letters. She was desperately hunting for a paper trail of immense wealth, deeply terrified by the word agreement she had overheard during the disastrous dinner. Just as Claire triumphantly discovered a sealed folder bearing the official board of directors stamp, the heavy wooden door swung open, and Luke stepped into the room, instantly catching sight of her hands violating his private documents. His sharp, commanding voice sliced through the tense air as he loudly demanded to know exactly what she thought she was doing, rummaging through his desk. Claire slammed the drawer shut with frantic speed, but she was not nearly fast enough to hide her obvious guilt from his piercing gaze. She completely fabricated a lie, claiming she had simply been waiting for him, and was overwhelmed with deep concern for his emotional well-being after the fight. Luke tossed his heavy leather briefcase onto the desk, aggressively questioning whether she was truly worried about his heart, or simply worried about the highly confidential financial papers she was secretly trying to read. Claire defensively stepped closer, attempting to place a soothing hand on his tense arm, whispering that Madeline was maliciously trying to manipulate his entire family and steal everything he had worked so hard to build. She urgently insisted that he needed to strike back ruthlessly before his vengeful wife could successfully weaponize the hidden asset shielding agreement against them. Luke did not physically pull away, but his rigid body completely rejected her manipulative, calculating touch. He stared intensely at her and asked, with genuine exhaustion, if she even understood a single thing about the complex legal contracts she was so desperate to uncover. Claire stubbornly held his gaze for several long seconds, coldly declaring that if he hesitated for even a moment, Madeline would ruthlessly take every last penny he owned. However, instead of igniting his anger, her cruel words only forcefully reminded him of Madeline's quiet, heartbreaking dignity from the night before. At exactly 9:30 in the morning, Luke sat nervously across from the family's senior corporate attorney, Dr. Stewart, a gray-haired man who knew far too many dark secrets to ever look genuinely surprised by a crisis. The urgent meeting took place in a heavily soundproofed conference room with the thick vertical blinds tightly drawn to block out the bustling city view. Luke demanded the absolute, unvarnished truth without any further evasions or corporate doublespeak. Dr. Stewart folded his hands deliberately, explaining that back in 2019, the company had faced a catastrophic liquidity crisis, and his father's personal guarantees were nowhere near enough to stop the bleeding. The seasoned lawyer revealed that Madeline had injected a massive influx of capital from her maternal inheritance, securing it through an ironclad protective framework that legally shielded her assets from any future familial betrayals. While Luke was painfully discovering the full extent of his own profound ignorance, Madeline received an unexpected visitor at her quiet downtown apartment. It was Jessica, Luke's loyal assistant, standing awkwardly in the hallway, looking incredibly pale and nervously clutching a thick manila envelope in both of her trembling hands. Madeline welcomed the young woman inside without asking any immediate, pressuring questions, sensing the deep internal conflict battling behind her tired eyes. Jessica nervously explained that Claire had been caught snooping in the private office earlier that morning, desperately hunting for highly confidential board documents related to the family's core assets. The assistant confessed that she had overheard Claire on a secretive phone call, aggressively demanding to know exactly how much of the family's immense wealth was still freely available to be claimed before the messy divorce proceedings officially finalized. Madeline carefully opened the thick envelope, discovering a printed copy of a highly incriminating email that Claire had accidentally forwarded to the wrong corporate department. In her frantic haste, the detailed message explicitly asked a shady financial consultant about the strategic legal loopholes required to secure a massive fortune through a future common-law marriage with the heir. Madeline calmly folded the damning paper and sincerely thanked Jessica for her incredible bravery, noting that people who recklessly break into a house just to steal a seat at the table usually end up tripping over their own clumsy feet. Later that afternoon, as the setting sun painted the city in shades of deep orange, Madeline's phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. The cryptic message warned her to be extremely careful with her next move, hinting darkly that not all of the family's old debts had been cleanly paid off with simple cash. The mysterious, unsigned message glowed brightly on Madeline's phone screen for an uncomfortably long time, its chilling words echoing in her mind. Be extremely careful with what you intend to reveal. Not all of the family's old debts were paid with money. The short sentence contained no obvious signature, no explicit physical threat, and lacked the dramatic flair of someone who merely wanted to cause a fleeting scare. It was far worse. It felt exactly as if it had been precisely crafted by someone who knew precisely which hidden nerve to strike. Madeline stood perfectly still by the large window of her quiet apartment, watching the endless stream of bright headlights cutting through the darkening city streets below. A chilling memory from the brutal winter of 2019 suddenly surfaced, rushing through her veins like ice water. She vividly remembered Arthur sitting alone in the grand study, his eyes completely bloodshot, stammering that some corporate debts never showed up on the official balance sheets. At that time, she had naively assumed he was merely speaking of injured pride, called-in favors, and informal gentlemen's agreements made with desperate bankers behind closed doors. Now, this sinister message strongly suggested something far more treacherous and permanently damaging to the family legacy. The golden wedding ring she had removed the previous night still sat abandoned on the small wooden table, right next to the damning envelope Jessica had bravely delivered. When her phone suddenly rang, the loud noise startled her so badly, she nearly dropped the device onto the hardwood floor. It was Dr. Robert calling with extreme urgency, completely bypassing his usual polite greetings to ask if she had received any highly unusual or threatening communications within the last few hours. Madeline tightly closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath, and confirmed to her lawyer that she now knew the historic corporate bailout was not solely about balancing financial ledgers. The following morning, the high-stakes meeting at Dr. Roberts' sleek midtown office commenced with a heavy, chilling politeness that felt entirely rehearsed to mask the metaphorical blood already spilling onto the plush carpet. Madeline arrived first, dressed in a sharp ivory suit, choosing not to wear black like a grieving widow or bright colors like a victor, but simply dressing as a woman refusing to carry the filthy stains of someone else's war. Dr. Roberts solemnly placed 3 distinct folders on the polished glass table in front of her. The first was blue, containing the original asset shielding agreement. The second was gray, holding the complex corporate restructuring documents. And the third was a stark black folder she had never seen before in her life. Before the rest of the family arrived, the lawyer softly warned her that during the initial bailout, Arthur had explicitly ordered him not to investigate certain parallel obligations, an order the lawyer had strongly advised against. Dr. Robert explained with grim precision that there was compelling evidence suggesting a substantial portion of Madeline's injected capital was secretly diverted to prevent a massive corporate scandal from leaking to the press. Madeline felt her stomach twist into a painful knot as the true magnitude of the betrayal washed over her, realizing that the phrase parallel obligations was just a dressed-up, sanitized corporate term for ruthless extortion. Luke walked into the cold conference room mere minutes later, accompanied by a very nervous Dr. Stewart, looking significantly more exhausted and defeated than he had the previous night. He wore a dark, wrinkled suit, sporting an unkempt beard and the hollow, haunted eyes of a man who was rapidly watching his entire constructed reality crumble into dust. When he looked at Madeline, his gaze immediately dropped to her bare left hand, and the blatant absence of the golden band spoke volumes louder than any desperate apology he could ever offer. Following closely behind her son, Charlotte glided into the room like an elegant, inescapable shadow, stubbornly insisting on participating in the meeting despite never being formally invited. Madeline immediately shut her down, stating firmly that this was a strictly legal proceeding and that the concept of family had died the night they collectively decided to replace her with a mistress at the dinner table. Dr. Bud quickly opened the blue folder, methodically outlining the indisputable clauses of the financial protection agreement. He meticulously detailed the massive original investment, the absolute guarantees tied directly to the luxury real estate, and the severe penalties that would instantly activate in the event of coercion or defamation. When he formally mentioned her legal right to exclusively occupy the Upper East Side mansion, Charlotte completely lost her legendary composure, aggressively snapping that the historic house had belonged to their prestigious dynasty for multiple generations. Madeline fixed her mother-in-law with an icy, unwavering stare. She calmly suggested that Charlotte should have carefully considered the property deeds before deliberately using that very house as a theatrical stage to humiliate and discard her. The bitter argument would have undoubtedly continued in that toxic, familiar loop of massive egos clashing against legal documents if Dr. Robert had not swiftly opened the ominous gray folder. He firmly interrupted the escalating bickering to announce that Madeline had received a thinly veiled threat late last night, deeply connected to the covered-up financial crisis of 2019. Luke snapped his head toward his estranged wife, genuinely shocked, demanding to know exactly what kind of threat she was facing. Madeline silently slid her unlocked cell phone across the smooth glass table, allowing him to read the sinister message for himself, watching as the remaining color completely drained from his pale face. Arthur, having been frantically summoned by his panicked son, finally arrived at the law office nearly an hour later, leaning heavily on a wooden cane Madeline had never once seen him use in public. Upon entering the tense room, the broken patriarch did not look at his angry son or his rigid wife. His deeply sorrowful eyes locked directly onto Madeline. He slowly confessed that years ago, a corrupt former director, Paul Norton, had viciously threatened to leak highly damaging documents to the major newspapers regarding illegal offshore operations. To protect their pristine corporate reputation and prevent total ruin, Arthur had secretly authorized massive hush-money payments to permanently silence the extortionist, desperately using the clean capital Madeline had generously provided. Luke shot up from his leather chair, completely horrified, yelling at his father for daring to use his wife's innocent money to quietly fund a dirty blackmail scheme behind his back. The devastating truth hung in the air like thick, suffocating smoke. For years, Madeline had silently endured being called a useless dependent, an ungrateful gold digger, and a completely unremarkable presence by the very people who had secretly stolen her wealth to cover up their own crimes. She turned to Arthur, her voice terrifyingly calm, reminding him that she had explicitly asked if there was anything illegal tied to the bailout, and he had looked her dead in the eyes and lied. Charlotte desperately tried to intervene, weakly arguing that powerful dynasties often had to navigate incredibly complex and morally gray situations to survive. Madeline cut her off with a look so ferociously cold that it practically froze the room, stating that corrupt families always loved calling their own filth complexity. But whenever they forced someone else to pay the devastating price, they conveniently called it a wifely duty. Later that very same afternoon, the explosive crisis violently escaped the soundproofed walls of the law firm and rapidly flooded the bustling corridors of Wall Street. Claire, furious at being entirely excluded from the crucial family negotiations, could no longer endure the terrifying sensation of losing her hard-won grip on the narrative. Believing that absolute control of the media cycle would secure her future, she made a reckless, desperate gamble by leaking a completely fabricated story to a prominent high-society gossip outlet. The sensational article viciously claimed that a deeply resentful, abandoned wife was maliciously threatening a prestigious, traditional family with stolen financial documents after being tragically left by her husband. Within mere minutes, elite group chats filled with wealthy executives, socialite wives, and aggressive journalists began frantically circulating the scandalous link, painting Madeline as a hysterical, vengeful woman rather than the actual savior of the corporate empire. Claire sat smugly in the lavish bathroom of an overly expensive midtown restaurant, scrolling through the cruel comments and briefly reveling in her manufactured temporary victory. However, her shallow satisfaction was instantly shattered when her phone rang with an incoming call from an untraceable, blocked number. A cold, menacing male voice whispered through the receiver, warning her that she had spoken far too loudly for someone standing on incredibly fragile glass. The stranger mocked her pathetic attempt to marry into a dynasty built entirely on buried secrets, advising her to watch her back before she ended up buried alongside their ancient, rotting debts. For the very first time since she had triumphantly seated herself in Madeline's dining chair, Claire felt a profound, paralyzing terror grip her throat, realizing she had unknowingly stepped onto a battlefield she did not understand. Back at the corporate headquarters, Luke was furiously confronted with the viral gossip article the moment he stepped off the private executive elevator. Jessica practically marched into his grand office without knocking, clutching her tablet with white-knuckled intensity, and a fierce expression that clearly stated she was absolutely done, pretending everything was normal. She shoved the screen toward him, bluntly stating that Claire was undoubtedly the malicious source behind the vicious smear campaign, as the article prominently featured the exact manipulative phrases the mistress had used that morning. Luke stared at the glowing screen, his face flushing with a deep, furious red as the last remaining shreds of his blind loyalty to his lover completely evaporated into thin air. He ordered Jessica to immediately cancel his entire afternoon schedule, grabbing his suit jacket with a sudden, desperate urgency to fix the catastrophic mess his own arrogance had created. Jessica took a deep, steadying breath and courageously asked what he planned to do about Madeline, gently warning him that his deeply wronged wife might not actually want to be saved by him anymore. Luke paused by the heavy oak door, heavily closing his tired eyes, and softly admitted that for the very first time in his entire privileged life, he truly understood that painful fact. He instructed his assistant to immediately contact Dr. Robert and prepare a formal, public retraction to fiercely defend Madeline's spotless reputation against the vicious lies. Meanwhile, alone in her quiet apartment, Madeline read the scandalous article with a strange, detached calmness, not feeling an ounce of surprise at the sheer predictability of their ruthless cruelty. The overwhelming temptation to instantly release the damning audit, expose the blackmail, and burn the entire corrupt dynasty to the ground surged powerfully through her veins. After years of silence, Madeleine finally chose justice over revenge. She ordered a full forensic audit that exposed forged documents, secret payments, and years of deception within the family empire. Evidence proved that her signature had been forged, leading to the collapse of Charlotte's lies and Claire's attempts to manipulate the situation. Luke publicly accepted responsibility for his failures, issued a formal apology, and stepped down as CEO to ensure a fair investigation. When Charlotte later begged Madeleine to withdraw the criminal complaint, Madeleine refused to erase the consequences of her actions, though she chose mercy by not taking everything from the family. During the divorce proceedings, Luke surrendered significant power, accepted accountability, and finally understood that genuine change requires more than empty apologies. The divorce was finalized under fair but strict terms, bringing an end to years of betrayal and manipulation. Luke returned Madeleine's wedding ring, admitting that he had spent too long confusing apologies with true growth. Madeleine walked away without anger or triumph, feeling only the freedom that comes from reclaiming her own identity. Meanwhile, Arthur confessed his financial crimes, and the audit continued to uncover the corruption that had poisoned the family and the company for years. Although the corporate empire survived, it emerged smaller, closely monitored, and cleansed of those responsible for the wrongdoing. With her restored wealth and independence, Madeleine founded an organization dedicated to helping vulnerable women trapped in abusive family businesses, using her experience to support others facing similar struggles. Months later, she agreed to meet Luke for a respectful conversation where they reflected honestly on their past, his personal growth, and the future. While she acknowledged the people they once were, she made it clear that their marriage could never be rebuilt. As they parted, she realized that true peace does not come from endless sacrifice or preserving a false image of harmony, but from protecting one's dignity and self-worth. Her journey proved that real strength lies in walking away from deception with integrity intact, choosing freedom, accountability, and a future defined by one's own values.